So I just wanted to start. I don't know if you can read these from out in the audience, but these are just some quotes from that were made in the late 1800s. And I was reading through the Hornaday book just, you know, a couple of days ago, and I was just getting like chills down my spine. Like these ideas and some of these quotes and observations that people were making, and particularly this one, it's like I can't even comprehend like what bison look like on this continent, you know, as little as like 150 years ago. Some of these sightings that were from the Arkansas River, and this was already when bison were declining. It's like I can't even imagine what a herd of bison that lasts for 25 miles by, I believe, 50 miles in the other direction. And it's just this, you know, shaped like a wedge on the landscape, moving across the grasslands, like centered on a river. It was the Arkansas River. Just by like estimating, if you read like, you know, further into some of these historical accounts, just by estimating, you know, the amount of space that they covered and how many animals were occupying an acre, like this group was somewhere between 3 and 4 million animals. And that's when I started thinking, I was like, what existed in North America isn't even comparable to, say, like the Serengeti Plains today. And yeah, it just blows my mind. And in the moment of time, you know, they were essentially gone in 100 years. And bison would have been, how many?
In 20.
Yeah. So like, and for this, please, like just speak up, or if you're more comfortable, just raise your hand. You know, the point of this, I'm a federal employee, I'm a federal public servant. Bison is contentious. And it's important to me as part of the community to just sit with the community and talk about bison. But, you know, in a blink of time, the herds were gone. There was a handful of individuals, there were about 5 of them. You know, Buffalo Jones, Charles Goodnight, Dupree, McKay up in Canada, and I'm missing one. Well, there's a 5th one. The Duprees, if I didn't say that. And, you know, what they were doing is they were ranchers, and they're opportunistic. And it was probably hard work and hard living. And they, as the buffalo herds were being demised, they would steal some calves off the corners of groups. And it was also to make a profit. So immediately, those calves were crossbred with cattle to try and build the North American grazing animal. So bison were gone everywhere except in the Lamar Valley. And it was actually about 15 or 20 miles south of there. There were a couple of hundred animals that survived the Great Extirpation because people couldn't access the area. And then those numbers dwindled, even though we brought the military in to protect them, down to probably 23 animals in 1902. And at that point, that was the last of the wild buffalo. And, you know, we kind of turned the corner, and we spent the last 150 years in the park. No, that's not right. Whatever 1902 to today is, you know, trying to bring back the closest resemblance to, you know, these herds that drove grasslands, period. I mean, groups of 4 million bison would have fundamentally structured how the grasses existed on the landscape, how nutrients were cycled, and as the base of the food pyramid, they would have structured what sits on top. And we've tried to bring that back here. There's not another example that I really know of in North America where we've been able to do that. But, you know, kind of standing alone, trying to do something different, this is the world that we've created. You know, there really is not a shortage of opinions of bison, and I'm just going to dive into it. The park should be fenced. We should have just a small show herd a couple hundred animals fenced in the Lamar Valley. We should have tribes hunting bison in the park. We shouldn't have bison outside of the park. We should depopulate and restart the park with a brucellosis-free herd. We should vaccinate animals. We should tag every animal. We should capture every animal. We should let it go. We should just let buffalo do what buffalo once did, and people outside of the park can just deal with it. You know, there are so many opinions with bison, and most people feel like they have the solution or the right belief. So if there's millions of people who feel that way, that means there's no right answer. And that created, you know, the world we live in today. So there's 5,000 bison in the park. You know, there's one herd that moves across the northern range. You know, they'll, in the summertime, move further down into, you know, the Mirror Plateau and move into Pelican Valley. You know, there's another herd of bison that live in these grasslands. They follow the rivers out to West Yellowstone or follow the rivers up north. And when bison relearn to migrate, you know, these animals move about 1,000 miles across the year throughout the park. It has created probably one of the most complex wildlife dilemmas that I know of today. What do you do when animals leave the park? Because they're almost everywhere else where you manage buffalo, they're considered as trespass livestock outside of Theodore Roosevelt, outside of Wind Cave. In Grand Canyon, not really. Depending on where you go, there's just no tolerance for them. So when the animals relearn to migrate in the park, the state of Montana sued the Park Service when they first exited the park. In 1992, we signed like a memorandum of agreement between the federal government and the state of Montana to come up with a joint plan. But that was very hard because on one side, it was, we need to get rid of brucellosis. I'll explain what that is in a second. And we don't want animals outside of the park. On the other side, it was, we want animals to be able to be treated like grizzly bears and wolves and eagles and fish and everything, and elk and everything else in the system. So we couldn't come to resolution. We pulled out at the last second. We were put under court moderation and mediation, and we're essentially agreed to something in 2000, which set a size for the bison population. It was targeted at 3,000 animals. It committed the park to vaccinate the animals in the park to try to get rid of brucellosis. It created small tolerance zones just outside of the park where the bison couldn't be, but they would be allowed over time. I'm simplifying a little bit. And it set up rules for different groups. Like the park would do this on this landscape, the state would do this on this landscape, APHIS would do this across landscapes, and it was just a series of state and federal agencies. And over the, I came here to implement that plan. I didn't know that when I accepted a job in Yellowstone as like a young wildlife technician, just wanting to like learn about bison. I remember within the first year, I'm in the middle of Hayden Valley, which is down here, in the middle of winter, standing in this thermal creek. There's this picture of me, and I've got like just like my boxers on. I'm standing in this hot water, and the snow's this high, and I'm waiting for a bison to poop to collect like a sample from it. And then literally like a week later, I'm at the boundary here in Gardner at our bison capture facility. Some people refer to it as Stevens Creek. And people are riding by on horses yelling, "Shut it, shut it, shut it." And I'm supposed to shut this gate to capture 200 wild bison that were then going to go to slaughter. So I was just like, what did I sign up to do? I don't understand what is happening. I don't understand how so many people can't find common ground. And so 20-something years later, I run the program. I've seen a lot of other managers come and go in the different entities here. I feel like I don't have enough gray hair. Maybe I just like dye it well enough so you can't tell. Like I feel like I'm one of the older statesmen. When we meet as groups to try and talk about what do we do now. Let me just see what the next slide is. Oh yeah, let me do this. So today, just to fast forward a little bit further, today, Bison, by an order by the previous governor of the state, created these tolerance zones. So bison are allowed to migrate outside of the park. We're right here in Gardner. This is Yankee Jim Canyon, Paradise Valley. So bison are allowed to migrate and occupy this area year-round if you're a male. Females are supposed to be moved back into the park or into this wilderness section on this side in the month of May.
How do you move them?
Oh my gosh. We don't really anymore. That was a thing of the past. We really don't anymore. That was a thing once upon a time. And so you can see we have the national forest lands, the national park lands. We have private lands, these white inholdings. We have the state of Montana. We have tribes that can exercise treaty rights on anything that's green. And some tribes maybe argue anything that's brown, where they can exercise rights from treaties that were signed in the 1860s and 70s. So it's a melting pot. And depending on where that animal is standing, a different person, a different entity makes the rules. And this IBMP was created once upon a time to say, wildlife don't know boundaries and they don't know rules. How can we try and work together so when a bison stands here and stands here, it's living the same life instead of the rules are changing dramatically? Because I'll get into this later, like bison are migratory. They need to move to live and then to shape grasslands. So a lot's changed. Let me go back since we started that original plan. So there used to be cattle right here on the park boundary. That's no longer the case. We've learned a lot about brucellosis. Elk, carry the disease. They transmit it to bison. Bison carry the disease too. They haven't transmitted it to livestock because of all of the intensive efforts that we put into it. Would it be helpful if I said one or two things about brucellosis, or should I just keep going?
I just want to know how bad really is it? Do the bison really have it? And is it really being transmitted?
The bison do have it. It's being transmitted among bison and probably from bison to elk. So the disease is it's not a good, the pathogen is very weak, which means if the immune system can detect it, it wins every time. It snuffs out the infection. So the bacteria tries to get into an animal by sniffing, by licking, by this area, and then it immediately tries to hide within the lymphatic system. So hide within your lymph nodes and places like that, and persist for a long time until the animal becomes pregnant. When the animal's pregnant, the bacteria try to move to the reproductive tract without being detected by the immune system. If they get detected by it, it's over. And then if they get to the immune system, they start replicating really quickly. And the body has a dampened immune system there because half of what's in a fetus is dad. So it's not self. So the immune system's dampened. But eventually the body recognizes it. And then it's like, oh my gosh, something's not right. And it gives birth. And it tends to give birth earlier than later. And we refer to that as like a brucellosis birth or a brucellosis stillbirth. So we lose some, but I mean, I think maybe this is a really bad example, but it's one we all live through. Like with COVID, things have changed a lot, right? The first wave of infection was different than where we are today. So this disease and bison have been evolving together for 100-something years. So things don't play out like they would in a herd of cattle that's never been exposed to the disease and is suddenly exposed. So abortion rates are not as high. Bison tend to give birth to live calves that can cope with the disease. So it really has minimal impacts on the health of the herd.
My understanding is it only affects the first birth. Is that true?
That's really close to true. There's always an outlier, right? But I would say 90-something% is that first birth. And it depends on when mom got infected. So if mom gets infected, when she's already pregnant, you're probably going to have a better chance of an abortion. But if mom got infected maybe as a calf and that bacteria's got to persist for 2 or 3 years, usually there's a little bit of an immune response already built and it dampens the impact. So
the cow, that's not an issue. I mean, the cow doesn't work the same way because they've not been exposed. So they have major issues with it. Is that right?
I think that's what the literature would say. I guess I'm a bison rancher, but I've never been a cattle rancher. Yeah.
So are the elk affected as well?
They are, and isn't that the kicker here? That the elk have the disease. The elk are transmitting the disease to cattle in this area. And the people who manage lands in these other places are more comfortable with that than they are with bison.
But you see elk in the cattle herds.
I know.
You don't see bison and cattle.
I know, because we prevent that to a lot of extent. So all this management plan is based on not having bison and cows in the same place.
But they don't object to the elk.
That's correct.
Because they can hunt the elk.
That's probably right. There's a lot of value in that.
Is that how do they know that it's elk infecting cattle, not bison? Is it just that there have been elk in the fence and not bison?
You study the bacteria that lives within the host.
Okay.
So the bacteria that are found in cattle outbreaks are the same genetically related bacteria that are found in elk, not bison.
And so it mutates.
So it
fast
mutates
enough that
quickly,
tell
and you
if it
can
came from a bison or an elk.
and you can track that. Hey, isn't it crazy?
They don't object to the elk.
Yeah.
That's because they can hunt them. That's what I've always felt.
So we were sued in 2018 and 19 that this plan's outdated. There's other things that changed. When it started, there was no tribal hunting outside of the park. Now there's lots of tribal hunting outside of the park.
When you slaughter animals, those all go to the tribes. Right?
They do go to the tribes. The meat is given to the tribes presently. So we decided we're rewriting our management plan. We're going to release it next week to, so it's gone through a formal NEPA process. So that means this started over 2 years ago. We've put out the purpose, the alternatives. We've received 27,000 comments. We've tried to incorporate those comments. Going back to the slide, there's a lot of opinions about bison. There's only so much we can do, but we're going to solidify the progress that's been made over time. And we want to keep leaning forward for opportunities for conservation when the people who own the lands that the bison are going into are ready for it. I'll get back to this kind of towards the end. I wanted to go over things about numbers, because numbers mean a lot with bison. The original plan specified a target of 3,000 animals. We haven't been there. We've averaged 5,000 animals for the last decade. We were at 6,000 animals 2 years ago. We're less 3 years ago. We're less than that now. It can really be a source of contention. But bison are, I'm sure Doug or Dan or Kira will tell you something else. I'm sure Carrie, if he talks to you, will say something else. But if they're not they're one of the top reasons people come to this park. And it's not to see a couple of them. It's to see what you see in the Lamar Valley, because that's what North America once looked like, and it doesn't exist anywhere else on the planet today. And it's an incredible importance to the town I live in, that we live in. It's incredibly important. You know, for the work we do in the park, so we go out, we collect genetic samples from animals every breeding season. We do that with like a biopsy dart. And gosh, you don't trust a lawyer and you don't trust a geneticist, right? Those are like good rules to lead life through. And the reason why is that, you know, there's so much in genetic information, it's hard to know where to look and where to make statements. So when we go out there and look at certain what are called markers, sections of DNA, we know that this park needs about 3,500 animals to maintain 99%, to have a high chance of not degrading what's here. Things can degrade here because there's not enough males and females, because there's large removals, whether it be hunting or trapping in some years, that can just randomly take out a whole bunch of animals. So to protect that, you need more animals than we agreed to in the original plan. So that's really important, because these are the last wild descendant bison that were not intentionally bred with cattle. We should be focusing on how do you take this and move it to other conservation areas. Then we need to manage for numbers that won't protect what we have here. You know, some other things about genetics. Do you all know about like northern central herd, some of the story? I'll tell it. So I'll use a map. So when we were down to 23 animals, they wintered right here. And then in the summertime, they'd move up here. And then they'd maybe move across here and then come back down. And that's just from reports. I'm sure they did other things, but from like ranger reports, you know, they're living in this area. And so we call that the indigenous herd. And then we brought some animals from Montana and Texas and put them in a holding pasture here in Mammoth in 1902. And we moved them to Lamar Valley in 1907. And then we started ranching those animals. And then we did the same thing that people were doing, like Buffalo Jones and Dupree were doing. We ran into Pelican, we poached some calves, we stole some calves, brought them back up here. And then by like the 1920s, you know, this introduced and indigenous herd was just completely mixing with each other. You couldn't, like superintendent reports and things, you couldn't tell who was from the original herd and who wasn't. So we created one herd, which I would call the northern herd, originally in the park. And then in 1936, and we plopped some of them out of here and put them here and here. And these two valleys are connected by a river. So we created the central herd in 1936. So you have this northern herd and this central herd. And they're kind of separate entities from 1936, 37, probably all the way up until about the 80s, other than some males switching between them. So because of that, and because they came from small numbers, the genetics started to, like, you could tell that they were like not breeding with each other. It was very subtle, but you could tell they were not breeding with each other. And that was in the late 80s and 90s when we were collecting information. And then the herds blew up because we relaxed some of the management, and things started mixing. We started realizing that animals from here would summer here one year, they'd walk over here and summer here, and the herds just become more and more mixed. So when we go out today, you can't tell where an animal came from. You just see one giant metapopulation with two separate breeding groups. Now you can even go a little deeper. you can look at just the mom's genetics, and those things are conserved for a very long time. So no matter where we go in the park, we can find moms that came from the original Montana herd and moms that came from the original indigenous herd. And they're spread equally through, almost equally, throughout this entire place. So it's like, I think over time, I'm sure management had something to do with it. Bison kind of started redoing like that 25-mile by 50-mile group. They started just grouping up into groups of groups. And it's probably the only meta population alive today.
So the animals that came from Texas and where? Montana?
Montana.
Were they?
That's
Are
great.
they
I know what you're going to ask. Were they bred with cattle?
Yeah, exactly.
Good question. So the females were from walking coyote. So it was a mixture of a Blackfoot member, Blackfeet, member, and Confederate Salish and Kootenays, the Flathead tribes. And they sold that herd to Pablo and Allard, who were ranchers, and they had not yet started intentionally crossbreeding, as far as the records say. So there's no sense from the females. Now the 3 bulls came from Texas. Charles Goodnight, he was known to crossbreed. We killed one of those bulls in the first winter that it was here. So then it's a matter of, did those other 2 bulls have any indication of cattle introgression? And then, did they actually breed here? Those are tough questions.
And what is the genetics?
The research is on both sides. First it was absolutely, there's no indication of introgression. Then a paper came out 2 years ago that said, every animal in North America was introgressed, because even when you look at bison samples from like the early 1800s, you could detect cattle in them. And there's a paper now that's just about to come out of Canada that was based on mostly the animals in this park. And then these historic samples that were from like 1,000, 1,200, 1,400, and they were finding that the last analysis was actually just looking at shared ancestry, because all the things they were calling cattle introgression were in bison in like 1,100. So these 2 species are very related. So I would say, don't know the answer.
Yes.
I think it's a hard one to answer. So usually when I come to Gardner, or in the other times I've come to Gardner, this is the first thing that comes up. The meetings are generally very contentious. And, are there too many animals in the park? Are they overgrazing the park? Because if you used to create grasslands with these massive wedge-shaped groups of bison, the only plants that would have survived would have been grazing-resistant plants, fast-growing plants, and short-growing plants, things that could handle that grazing. The general model for livestock that we've used throughout most of North America, it varies, but a lot of them focus more on like a slower growing, tall grass on the landscape, which is much less tolerant to grazing. So if we're not seeing a lot of that in the park, that's a sign that we're doing something wrong. There's way too many animals in the park. And this comes up all the time. So if you look at, these are the places where bison typically go in the park. This is based on like radio collars. These are areas of grasslands based on, what the satellites say, that are at least 1,000 acres of continuous grassland. So this isn't counting the room-sized patches that are all throughout this park. So bison use about 40% of the grasslands in this park, of the grazable acreage. Then when we move over here, this brown thing is just another version of this orange thing. So this is where the bison are using areas. If you were to stock this park, like we stock Theodore Roosevelt Park, or we stock Wind Cave, you would estimate how much grass mass is produced, then allocate about 25% of that grass mass to grazing herbivores like bison, because that leaves the remaining 75% to other animals, to defecation, to bedding, and things of the sort. It leads to generally sustainable grazing. So if you take that model in Yellowstone, these are the areas that bison are grazing more intensely. It comes out to be about 30,000 acres in the Tower Junction to Lamar area. And you see it when you go out there. It's just plain as day. That's 6% of the grazable acres in the park. It's just we happen to have a road there. But it has created a massive amount of debate. That's,
Cattle
yeah,
graze different than buffalo.
they do.
You sit in the back of your truck and have a picnic.
Yeah.
And the herd's way down.
Yeah,
And it's amazing how fast they just nip and move, nip and move.
I know, isn't it?
Cows will just hang out in one area.
Yeah,
So it's not apples to oranges.
it's not. It's not.
It's amazing.
And I mean, that's exactly what you're saying. These animals, they don't, you might see bison in Lamar most days for periods of the summer, but they're not the same animals. That's why I still don't know if that white calf's out there. They move like you would not believe. 1,000 miles in a year just by connecting the dots of radio collars. So I mean, this is a smaller version of what that quote described. It's like you've got one group, you've got another group, you've got another group, you've got another group, and it just continues down the valley, and they're all kind of moving in coordination as they go. This is not 15 by 50 miles or 25 by 50, but it's maybe 5 by 2. And I think we're starting to see something that once happened in North America. So first, you're right about migration. So these animals start kind of like surfing the green wave. That means, they're down in Gardner when the snow is melting, the grasses are emerging. They do that because that provides the highest quality food to an herbivore in terms of the ratios of protein to carbohydrates. And then they move with that wave of green up, and then they stop. Instead of continuing to follow it up like elk or deer or pronghorn, they start these circle-like grazing patterns, returning to the same place about every 7 to 12 days. And that's just based on putting collars in animals, because they know that returning to that area is of huge benefit to them. And it's not happening everywhere. Like that 6% of the park's grassland, that's this dark green line. I only have like 1 or 2 sciencey figures. So, all this is saying is like, this is like how much grass grows or how much plants grow in a place. And this is saying how much they eat of that. So when you get into these grazing lawns that they make, the Lamar, some of the wet areas around Tower Junction, small places in Hayden, they're picking out very particular wet, high productive areas, and they're grazing those much more so than other places in the park. And they're doing that for a very specific reason and on that moving pattern. So we find that when they do that, they accelerate the amount of nitrogen that goes right back onto the soil surface. They only absorb about 1 to 5% of the nitrogen they eat. That in turn stimulates the microbial populations like massively, which then break down that nitrogen into a form that's available to plants. And then the plants uptake that, and by having short plants, it's contrary to what you would think. It keeps the soils moist, because the ways that soils lose most of their moisture is through something called transpiration loss. It's like opening up pores or stomates on the grasses to absorb carbon dioxide to grow, but water leaves the plant at the time. So like if you're a big tall plant, you lose more water than if you're right on the soil surface where there's high humidity. So by doing this, they're just accelerating the rate that nitrogen is moving through the system. Because nitrogen's not created or destroyed. It's like water, it moves. So what we find is that all you need to know is that these light blue ones are places where we set up these big fences you see in the park, where we try and see what's happening where there's not bison. And these places are where we're measuring just outside those fences. So the amount of nitrogen or the amount of protein that bison are getting out of the grassland by their grazing patterns is about 150% higher by the way they're moving, returning, grazing in mobs. That's pretty wild. That means just they've made more habitat for themselves here for 150% more. And that's going to benefit all of the other herbivores.
How fast do you see that change? Like the little tiny explosions
Yeah.
out in Lamar, is that what's one of the things that's being
Yeah.
studied there?
Yeah, so there's a couple of them in Lamar. There's really little tiny ones, and now we're putting up ones that are about the size of this room. So it's a mixture of those. So the little tiny ones are used more to measure how fast the grass is growing. And then there's usually where the little tiny ones are, there's something that's about 10 meters by 10 meters, and then something like, no, that's wrong. 3 meters by 3 meters, and then something like the size of this room, where we're trying to look at those differences. So it's happening really quickly.
Because those are only a couple of years,
Yeah.
maybe 5 years old.
Yeah, so we only look within the year.
Wow.
And now, so you would think if this is happening within the year, if you so if they're speeding up, bison have like just turned the treadmill on to 10. So if you then close out grazing for a couple of years or 50 years, you're just going to slow that system down. So I would think the effects would become more pronounced over time. I mean, that's how they did it, right? That's how you had 60 million, because they didn't have big elevation gradients in Oklahoma or Nebraska. They could move latitudinally, but it was these mobs moving together in wet areas along rivers where they were able to take control of how nutrients move through the system for their own benefit and take over the continent.
And sustain that many animals.
And sustain it for a long time. So I was going to go back into management now, and then we can just end it. So another thing bison do is they play the weather in the wintertime. That means it's very unpredictable. The same animal that lives in Lamar one winter will be out at Yankee Jim Canyon in a different winter. And that creates a difficulty if we're going to commit to only managing bison at the park boundary, which we are committed to do. Because some years they don't come, some years they don't. So we've created this like seesaw over time. Some of this seesaw is because bison give birth in May, and it's a sudden pulse of 800 to 1,000 calves. And then sometimes, like in a year like this, they just naturally declined, and then there's another calving pulse. Other years, they moved to the boundary, and then the population was reduced by management through hunting, through rounding up animals. And you can't manage for a single number in this population. That idea of just 3,000 didn't make any sense. There's 3 tools that we're trying to use today to control numbers. The Bison Conservation Transfer Program, something we call the Tribal Food Transfer Program. It's all people refer to it as shipment to slaughter, and harvest outside of the park. So this was what Joshua was talking about. I probably had to turn my volume up, but this was 2019. So the tribe, the Assiniboine and Sioux of Fort Peck, were welcoming the first Yellowstone bison back to their lands. And we had moved 55 animals up there, which was the first live transfer of animals outside of this park. And then we rely on the tribes to distribute the animals further and to, and to conserve them and live with them as they please.
Do they make any commitment to not interbreed, to not breed them with cattle?
I don't know. The Assiniboine Sioux, yes. They have a conservation herd on 20,000 acres that's just for Yellowstone only bison because, they were the closest related animals to the animals that they once were able to hunt and harvest. I think every tribe probably has a different goal, and I think that that's okay, because I know something that's not going to happen is that bison are just going to stroll into Paradise Valley and keep going north. So it's going to take some creativity. Oh, you don't have to do that. So this was up at Fort Peck. This was the first bull that got off. This is him or somebody where they are today. So it's a mini Yellowstone. We're trying to do the same thing maybe in Wind River if the tribes would like to do that over time and other places. My hope is to, and then I'll get there in a second. Shipment to slaughter has been something we've done for a long time. 6,000 to 9,000 animals since 2000. That's been substantially reduced in the last 5 years to hundreds. We're trying to rely on harvests outside of the park. It doesn't always work. I don't have a slide for it, but there's 8 tribes that come to harvest animals on the perimeter of the park. They are hunting under treaty rights, hunting under their own defined hunts. There's a lot of variation. It takes a lot of coordination to try and allow that to happen.
Are they taking the whole bison with them?
I think it depends.
Are they taking the meat and the?
I think it depends. I think
So
it
some are
depends.
just leaving?
I really think it depends. Like some years, like 2 winters ago, there were close to 1,200 animals harvested. It's never happened before. Now I will say, if the tribes weren't harvesting, we're up at 6,000 animals. And the other alternative would have been a slaughterhouse. But in years like that, maybe not as many parts of animals were taken. In years like this last winter, where there were roughly 41 harvests, there's a lot of variation in the migrations from year to year, which is what causes those fluctuations in the population. Maybe more are taken. And yeah.
Hey, Chris,
Yeah.
I was wondering, in the old days, the design of the capture facility was very poor,
Yeah.
very livestock, and it was very invasive.
Yeah.
They were using, sticks
Yeah.
and noisemakers and yelling at the buffalo and standing up above them
Yeah.
to do that, which is really the opposite, as we found out, to do with buffalo. And so I was hoping, and I thought I'd heard, George, because of hopefully enough money and education, that capture facility has now been redesigned in some ways to make it a bit more with rounded gates and people down on the ground and quiet, and moving them through in small groups that we didn't see in the old days. They just ran them. It was ugly. And the point I think I'm getting to is that people that don't like to hunt, I'm not a big hunter, I'm not, I could care less one way or another about hunting in some ways, but I do have opinions about it, but I'm not a big hunter. But when you see the way they were treated in a capture facility, it brought tears to everybody's eyes, the blood and the fur flying, honest to God. You were there.
I know.
And boy, we had our cameras moving to get some of it, just because it was so awful. But when somebody was against the hunt, I felt like saying, boy, you need to see some of the footage of the stuff that goes on inside of there, the torture stuff. And then they put them in, you know, these transports and send them for fast as they can drive to the slaughterhouses. And by the time they get there, they're gored up and not doing so good, some of them. So it was like, I'd rather have a quick bullet that takes them down quick, whether it's ugly or not for you, as opposed to the torturous length of time that they were processed and then finally slaughtered. And when I brought up, one thing that was interesting, the information officer at the time, I won't say who she was, but she was very nice. And we brought this up and we were all sort of crying coming out of the place. And I said, my God, can't we get maybe a portable slaughterhouse to put out here and just send them through the slaughterhouse without sending them miles away, hurting each other all the way, you know, and having calves and all kinds of stuff in the trucks. And she said, George, what happened the last time we killed animals in Yellowstone? I said, it was 1967, and it was elk herds, and it stopped the elk herds being killed inside the park. I said, so let's get this out there and figure out something else, because obviously you can see there's not a dry eye in this place.
Yeah.
Oh, and my question is, with all that background crap, is I hope that there has been some good improvements. I saw your piece on the transfer and you going, moving him through a capture facility and sending them out, and it looked great. And I hope that same kind of design is now here, state of the art, where it should be.
Yeah. I would say in the quarantine facility, yes. So we've tried to, unlike any of the federal herds, even unlike Turner's to some extent, we've built a on-the-ground, wide open facility. And, you know, we've trained with low-stress livestock handlers. Bud Williams would kind of be the protege, and then Whit Hibbard under him, to try and figure out, how do you ask animals that were born in the wild of Yellowstone to be like moved into like a disease testing program that's going to be inherently so like that facility that was made, which is at Stevens Creek, I would say is state of the art, and it should be an example to bison everywhere.
Cool. That's
You know?
That's been such a worry of mine.
Yeah. And then now it's
treated in the old days.
so there's always more work to be done. And we still need to do more work.
But there has been some good stuff.
But there's been some great stuff
If
that's
there's
been
ever
done.
a tour, hopefully we can get in and just see without buffalo there.
Totally.
What's going on there, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Oh, I didn't want to, how do we land here? But on brucellosis, you know, so we went to USDA more recently, and USDA went to the National Academy of Sciences. So that's basically try to pull together panels of people when there's conflicting information out there about what to do. And the general consensus that the world was given, we were given, was like, look, bison aren't the issue right now. This is an issue in elk. We need to figure out ways to manage that in elk before you take any action, further action in bison, because it just wouldn't make sense. So you may hear all sorts of rhetoric about vaccinating bison. Why aren't we vaccinating bison? Well, this is why. Because everybody knows that the tools aren't out there, and it doesn't make sense right now. Now the park will work to no end to protect our neighbors outside of the park. That's what we've done for 24 years. And we're going to continue to do that. Because if we don't, there's nowhere to move forward.
What about the other hoofstock, bighorn sheep,
Yeah,
mule deer?
not as much so. Like they get infections for a fleeting moment. They can't like sustain it in their herd. So it just kind of comes and goes. So they're what you would call dead end hosts. So The point of this talk, I didn't know what I was going to be walking into tonight, was to talk about our new management plan on bison. The preferred alternative that was put out 29 days ago, this roughly outlines it, and we're going to issue a decision shortly.
Who wrote that?
I had a lot to do with it, but a lot of people did. We responded to 27,000 comments, and I'm a public servant. I need to try and do something that makes sense for as many people as possible, recognizing the answer is going to be disliked by everybody. We're going to continue the original purpose of the plan, which was we're going to conserve a wild herd. That means a genetically sound, migratory herd that can fulfill its ecological role in the park. We're also going to continue to protect the livestock industry of Montana. We're going to, that preferred alternative outlined a population range of 3,500 to 6,000 animals after calving. That's a range, I skipped the bullet, that's a range where we've been successful for many years. There's no reason to change course from what we're looking at. Of course, there's areas of the park that are grazed really heavily. There's also large areas of the park where there's some amazing phenomenon occurring again. It's a landscape with bison, so it's going to look different than all of the other landscapes in the area. We're going to prioritize to work with tribes. That's a lot of hard work to try and find ways to support hunting outside of the park, to find ways to return live bison to tribes, and to continue to reduce animals shipped to slaughter, but giving them meat and hides to tribes. We can't not acknowledge that there's limited range outside of the park. The park can support 10, 15,000 buffalo based on the amount of grass in the park in the summertime. There's a lot of snow some years. We know under a worst case scenario, we had the worst winter since 1996, 97 in 2023, I believe, or 22, 23. We had 6,000 animals, 4,000 animals exited into Gardner. That was all the community could handle. That was all we could do to try and reduce what could happen, the conflicts that could happen. It was every day, which is okay. I mean, that's what we're here for. But, those limits, unless there's more space for them outside of the park, kind of sets an upper limit on the population. Because if we were at 8 or 9, we couldn't have handled what would have been coming outside of the park. And, whatever we're going to do is going to recognize that the biggest driver of this economy are the people that come here. That's pretty cool. One of these days, I'm just going to do a talk with pretty pictures of bison and talk about science.
I love your opening shot.
Isn't it?
That's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Are you moving bison to American Prairie?
So right now, we are committed to move all bison from the park to a tribe for a final year of testing, and then we rely on the tribes to distribute them. If we reach a point where the tribes can't handle the number of animals that are available or don't want them anymore, then it's going to be our responsibility to figure out how to distribute them. So Fort Peck has distributed mostly to tribes, also to the CMR, a show herd in, that show herd is in, I'm blanking on the drive up. Where's the headquarters for the CMR?
What's CMR?
The Charles M. Russell Wildlife Refuge. Oh, I'm just blanking on it. It'll come to me later. Lewistown. So there's a show herd there that now is starting to have Yellowstone bison. And then its progeny are being moved out to other Fish and Wildlife Service units. Some have been moved to Fort Peck Dam, which is BLM land. Some have been moved to other places. But we really, this is about sharing the work, sharing the stewardship. So until the tribes can't find or aren't ready to take all the animals, it's kind of their discretion.
So there's been a lot of management effort, obviously, in
Yeah.
doing it. How comfortable are you with the fact that it's going to Bison or going elsewhere? And when you look down the road, are you comfortable with the fact that they'll be managed effectively?
It's a hard question. There's so much trust with bison. I would love to see other large herds stood up in places where there's place for them, managed like wildlife, where their numbers are controlled by hunting. Those opportunities are out there, but I would need a different job to kind of like make those sorts of things happen. So right now, I spend most of my day coordinating with people, whether it be tribes, whether it be other federal or state entities, veterinarians, trying to help people be successful. Because everything's at stake if we're not. What else? It's 8 o'clock, so I want to be respectful of your time too. So, thank you. Thanks for coming out.